Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm facing a big challenge because I'm supposed to introduce a great writer, thinker, and man with a big vision for our world in 1.5 minutes, Mr. Os Guinness. Os was born and grew up in the city of Nanking in China, which earlier suffered a great massacre. He traveled around India, he studied in Europe, he was studying under Guru in Rishikesh. He is a distant observer of the United States, as he called himself in one of his writings. And he has the privilege, had the privilege, and still has the privilege to meet great thinkers and writers of this world. All this has created a great base for his deep understanding of mankind in different cultural and religious settings. Os has written more than 30 books, and in one of them he has introduced the discourse of sustainable freedom, the topic of our conference, where we hope we can also contribute to this discourse was established earlier on. And if you are still wondering, yes, Os is a great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the founder of the great brewery Guinness. Os is yours.
Tremendous honor for me to be here, and I'm humbled because I see so many who are far more qualified than I to speak on this. It's a great privilege to be here. Living in America as an Englishman, I'm often asked by Americans why I'm interested in American freedom. And I often just short-circuit the discussion by telling them the story of Winston Churchill being shown around colonial Williamsburg. The American guide was waxing enthusiastic about what she called the cradle of the revolution against the English. Churchill stopped her and snorted. Revolution against the English, he said. They were Englishmen with English ideas fighting a foreign king with his foreign mercenaries. And there's a great truth to that, and I'm grateful for it. But of course, freedom in the West goes back far further than that. From the ringing cry of Moses, "Let my people go," down through the heroic Greek stands at Thermopylae and Salamis, down to the assassins of Julius Caesar who entered the forum with their blood-dripping daggers crying out, "Liberty, liberty," down through Magna Carta, down through the English Bill of Rights in 1689, and then the American and the French rights of man and citizen just 5 days apart, and of course down to the Universal Declaration in 1948. Freedom has been a ringing and central and recurring theme of our Western world. Although we must say, often freedom against the oppressions and injustices of the West itself. But today we face an irony. The word sustainable has become fashionable, almost a vogue word, with sustainable capitalism, sustainable environment, sustainable this, that, the other. But no one discusses sustainable freedom. And in many ways, that's the deepest and one of the most urgent of all. And I want to just set out some relatively simple, but some basic requirements that we may encourage our Western world to rethink the whole issue of freedom for our time. First, we need to challenge people to clarify what we mean by freedom. Gertrude Stein said famously, "A rose is a rose is a rose." But we can't say the same of freedom, because there are many questions that have to be asked before we really understand a freedom that truly is sustainable. One question is whether we see freedom as internal or external. Clearly, many of the faiths and worldviews argue that we have to begin with internal freedom. The Christian faith at this point does agree with Hindus and their view of moksha, with Buddhists and their view of right mindfulness, with Stoics and their view of ataraxia, other words, we have to begin internally, although the Christian view differs radically as what that internal freedom means. But it clearly holds that purely external freedom will never really change society and be a lasting benefit. Probably we have run the course of the European political revolutions. And as we see freedom today, the land of the free, for example, suffering from multiple addictions, you can see that we need to restore the necessity of internal and spiritual freedom at the heart of freedom. The second question is whether freedom is negative only or positive also. I remember as a student at Oxford often listening to Isaiah Berlin over dinner. Negative freedom, freedom from, which of course is fundamental and preliminary. But positive freedom, freedom for, freedom to be, is often completely ignored today. And in many of our countries we have a freedom that's essentially libertarian and only negative, which in the long run is quite unsustainable. And the third question we need to raise is whether all this is a matter of interest only or of loves too. And of course I'm referring to the difference between Cicero and his claim that human societies are merely an assemblage of interests, carried on by Hobbes and Machiavelli and many others. Or whether Augustine is more right by saying that societies are formed by their loved things held in common. And of course, freedom would definitely be in the second category. So we need to launch a fresh debate on the very nature of freedom, because it's so trivialized today and so misunderstood that it's unsustainable. Secondly, we need to face up to the core paradox of freedom. We often hear that freedom is not free, and that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. But many people forget an even deeper understanding, which is that the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. We can see down through history that freedom very easily comes down to permissiveness and then license and undermines itself. Or that freedom-loving people so care for security and safety that they become so safe, one nation under surveillance, that they lose their freedom. Or that freedom-loving people so prize freedom that they fight for freedom and fight in ways that contradict freedom, and so it undermines itself. But we can see that there are levels of this paradox. First, historical. One historian has said that if we squeeze the whole history of human civilizations into 1 hour, freedom-loving societies only come in the last few minutes, and are very rare and fleeting. There's a political dimension to the paradox. As Montesquieu, the great French philosopher, pointed out, freedom is not only a matter of structures, of constitutions and laws. It's a matter of the spirit of liberty, carried on from generation to generation, as what his disciple, Alexis de Tocqueville, called the habits of the heart. But the deepest part of the paradox of freedom is moral. Freedom requires a framework, but the only framework suitable and appropriate for freedom is self-restraint, not external restraint. And self-restraint, of course, is what almost always gets undermined when freedom flourishes, and it undermines itself. And we need to introduce back into the discussion a deeply realistic view of that paradox of freedom, and therefore of a challenge of seeking to sustain it. Thirdly, we need to remind people of the central tasks of establishing free societies. What's interesting is that they're very simple and rather obvious. But the one that comes home to our generation is the one that almost everyone forgets. The first task, of course, is winning freedom. The Greeks holding off the Persians. The Americans holding off colonial oppression as they they saw it by the English, or whatever. Winning freedom. And that, of course, to many societies is the glorious part, celebrated down the years. The second part, though, is ordering freedom. The Americans did that. The French did not. The Russians did not. The Chinese did not. And those three revolutions spiraled down to demonic disorder that created tyrannies worse than the ones they replaced for a number of years. The genius of the American one was not just the revolution, but the Constitution and the ordering of freedom in that country. But for the American founders, it was the third task that was the most challenging: sustaining freedom. Many Americans can quote, say, Benjamin Franklin, who came out of the Constitutional Convention, and when he was asked what they'd achieved, replied famously, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." The framers in their old age talked a lot about the perpetuation of our institutions. The young Abraham Lincoln, 50 years after the Revolution, in one of his early speeches as a 28-year-old, talked about the perpetuation of institutions and what he called the accounts running 50 years on from the Revolution. The pluses, the minuses, and how the United States was doing in sustaining freedom. I've lived in Washington, D.C. now for more than 20 years. I've never heard a single American leader address the question of sustaining freedom. But that, of course, is not the work of a few years, like the Revolution, or of several more years, like the passing of the Constitution, but the challenge of the running centuries themselves, and that means that it's our challenge. And we need to remind our fellow citizens, whatever country we are, that that challenge of sustaining the freedom we have is the real challenge today. Fourthly, we need to remember and explore the classical understanding of the menaces to freedom. I'm always intrigued that the American framers were not just revolutionary, they were rooted. They ransacked history. We could say they used history to define history. They knew the writings of Polybius or Cicero, and why the great classical authors understood that freedom never lasted. The wheel turned. Human states fail because human beings fail. And they were aware of how the wheel turns between monarchies and aristocracies and democracies. And if you put together their understanding of the menaces, there are three. The obvious one was external menaces. Suddenly a small nation will find itself threatened by a larger nation or a better armed nation, and unless it's prepared, it will be in profound trouble. But they went deeper than that obvious one. The second cause of the failure of states was what Polybius calls the corruption of customs. He argues that what's decisive for any nation is its constitution, the fundamental laws. Many Americans read that and go to sleep, thinking of the brilliance of their own constitution. But Polybius goes on. Constitutions rest in a bedding of customs, of moral values and traditions. And if those customs are corrupted, the best constitution in the world will not hold things together. And he warns how times of power and prosperity are particularly challenging to the best of constitutions. But the third menace is the deepest. In one word, time. As Christians, we would say the presence of sin and the passing of time, what Kant called the crooked timber of our humanity. You may know that Edward Gibbon wrote his famous classic, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and the last volume was published the same year as the American Constitution was passed. And in the final chapter, Gibbon raises the question, why did Rome fall? And his first answer, the injuries of time. And he says elsewhere that he got the idea for the book when he was in Rome and he saw cattle grazing and grass growing where the senators once deliberated. Time. He talks about the freshness of a painting becoming faded. A revolution becoming merely routine. And of question, of course, is how you renew and revive that freshness which is involved in sustaining freedom. The fifth challenge is to assess the various attempted antidotes to the decline of freedom. You can think back over history and see all the ways people thought that the society of their choice could be sustained. Plato's guardians, or Thomas Jefferson's idea that the American freedom would survive if the farming in America survived, and not everyone went to the European-style cities where they lost the values that farmers have so close to the soil. But in my own readings, I have never seen a more brilliant and daring antidote than the ones the framers themselves, apart from Jefferson, tried to bring in. They gave no name to it. Tocqueville, as I said, calls it the habits of the heart. In other words, not just law, but the spirit of liberty, the habits of the heart need to be passed on. My own word for it is the golden triangle of freedom. They didn't use that word. But if you read all their speeches addressing how freedom can be sustained, there is a triangle that's rather like the recycling triangle that goes round and round forever. The first leg of the triangle, freedom, requires virtue. You can see in our post-Christian age how that's completely dismissed. For example, the framers put a tremendous stress on the character of leaders, the bridge between leaders and followers, so that followers could trust leaders if they knew their character, even when they didn't know the reasons why leaders were making their decisions. When President Clinton was impeached, a number of American scholars wrote a letter to the New York Times saying character no longer mattered. All that mattered today was competence. The second leg of their triangle, virtue, required faith of some sort. Where was the inspiration of virtue to come from? What was the content of virtue to be? And also, what were the sanctions that were understood if people were not virtuous? And they understood that they came most strongly from the faith. In America, not established, but free to enter and engage public life. And the third leg of the triangle, faith of any sort, requires freedom. And as you know, after 1,500 years of various European experiments in relating faith in public life, many of them coercive and creating great reactions against themselves, I'm one who believes, along with others, that much of our European secularity is a direct reaction to corrupt and oppressive state churches in the past, seen very clearly in the French Revolution and its notion we must strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. But America never had that problem because religion was disestablished, and as you know, it flourished not despite disestablishment, but because of it. Now that attempted antidote, of course, the golden triangle of freedom, the habits of the heart, is routinely dismissed today in many ways in America. Sixthly, I think we need to get people to be vigilant about many of the current confusions about freedom. For example, the confusion of the constant link between democracy and freedom. Anyone who reads history knows that many of the greatest thinkers were very cautious about the effects of democracy on freedom. Plato and Aristotle viewing the fact that it would lead to tyranny. Many of the 19th century liberals, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, Macaulay, and many, many others, warning very realistically about the fate of the future of democracy. And of course, the record of history. Many democracies have been highly illiberal, and an illiberal liberalism is stalking the earth today. Many monarchies have been far more liberal than many democracies. And of course, every totalitarian system has claimed to be democratic. And as we know, Hitler was voted in by more than 51% of the people. George W. Bush called that automatic link between freedom and democracy needs to be examined. The government of the people, by the people, for the people is much more challenging than many of those who cite that remember. The third confusion today, powerful in many of our countries, is the triumph of equality over liberty. The Persians honored the Greeks for the Greek stress on liberty and equality. And you can see the two ever since in the West. But you can also see that when equality trumps liberty, liberty dies. Clearly, they are in competition, sometimes in conflict. But equality is always artificial. Equality always appeals to the leveling instinct, which often is rooted in envy. And equality always assumes and requires an umpiring authority which makes people equal, which always aggrandizes the state. And you can see today in many of our countries how that confusion is powerfully aimed. The third confusion we have commonly today is the confusion and corruption of wisdom. It was understood that in the traditional world that democracies would generally be small, that republics would generally be medium-sized, and that to be a large state required a monarchy or an empire. The American framers, of course, tried to beat that, not only to create lasting freedom, but to create a large republic, not direct democracy like the Greeks, but indirect and representative. But of course, as the suffrage spread, the idea in the 19th century was that as suffrage spread, so universal education would spread too, so the people would be wise enough to be their own rulers. And again, once again, many of those who were realistic warned that the spread of universal education would lead to a debasing of education, but none of them saw the effect that the social media have meant in our world. So that today we have a cataract of information and an acceleration of events, and people's response often being reduced to the likes that you see on Facebook and elsewhere. In other words, purely emotional. And the question is raised whether democracy now has the wisdom to really sustain its own freedom. What does this mean in terms of renewing freedom? Well, first, as I began, we need to restore a realistic and robust understanding of freedom itself. Secondly, picking up Tocqueville's point, we need to see a restoration of civic education. The Greeks understood that you could always be tribespeople and only think in terms of your groups, or idiots, which for them was people who voted as purely private individuals, or the ideal citizens, people who understood their own interests, but also had a clear understanding of the common good of everyone. And we can see that it was understood too that in a free society, everybody's born free, but not everyone's immediately worthy of exercising that freedom. And they need to be educated for liberty, liberal education. They need civic education to pass on from generation to generation what it truly means to be a free people. And as John O'Sullivan hinted strongly, not hinted, made sure, we need thirdly to reopen the public square. Europe is considered highly secular, and it is. But I'm always intrigued by the fact that it's a great European atheist like Jürgen Habermas, who argues that if any religious voices are excluded from the public square, that is not liberal, is highly illiberal. You have many on the American side who are doing actually the opposite and turning in America much more into something like the French laïcité or Ataturk's secular Turkey. I finish with this thought. Tocqueville, who was a great lover of freedom and wrote the book American Democracy, A Democracy in America, many Americans think that he wrote it for them, whereas of course he wrote it fellow Frenchman. He was an admirer of the beginnings of American democracy and a disappointed lover of his own revolution in France. He made the remark that human societies, like human individuals, are nothing if not by their use of liberty. Liberty is the yardstick of individuals and of societies. But he also remarked that with revolutions, as with a novel, the hardest part to invent is the ending. Europe has had distinguished chapters fighting for freedom. And we can all remember the ones that stir us the most. But there's no question that the present trends in Europe today and in America today mean that we're in a crisis and crucial moment for freedom in our Western world. Thank you.